The book to be discussed today is Beyond Secularism, The Rights of Religious Minorities, written by Neera Chandhok. Neera Chandhok suggests in the book that the entire debate on secularism has entered a theoretical and political cul-de-sac, and that we should shift the ground of the debate in order to infuse it with relevance for the contemporary moment. Dealing in general with the global ethnic explosion and in particular with the rise of majoritarianism in India, the author argues that we need to move beyond the prevalent understanding of secularism in order to protect minority identities that are currently under attack by majoritarianism. Neera Chandhok exposes the theoretical shortcomings of secularism and the alternative toleration and deals in detail with associated normative political concepts such as democracy, equality, and rights. We have invited Neera Chandhok and Savita Singh to discuss the book Beyond Secularism, The Rights of Religious Minorities.
Professor Chandhok, tell me, what do you conceive, what are your arguments in this book, the main arguments?
I think historical moments arise in the biography of a concept when that concept becomes legitimate for whoever invokes it. It happened to socialism a few years ago, a few decades ago. It's happening to secularism. So secularism has, what in my opinion, become somewhat of a thinned out concept, partly because everyone who is in active politics is invoking it for his or her own purpose. So when people who should be otherwise violently disagreeing on a concept come to subscribe to that concept, it seems to me that there is some cause to worry. And it struck me when I was looking into the way this concept has been appropriated, often by groups and movements who have absolutely no commitment to secularism, that maybe we should relocate secularism within its constitutive context, and that is democracy. Because secularism cannot be an autonomous concept. If we look at the way it has been interpreted in India as Sarv Dharam Sambhav, then the concept of Sarv Dharam Sambhav is based upon equality, and equality is based upon democracy, and democracy goes along with rights and freedom. It was my stated intention in this book to strengthen secularism by looking at its antecedent moral principles, from where it is derived and by reference to which it is legitimized by. And therefore, I seek to look into these principles that inform secularism, particularly democratic equality and rights, and see if that would generate us some understanding of how to manage our multicultural polity.
Yeah. Secularism, when you're discussing the newness about this whole thing, your conception of going beyond secularism, is to introduce it as a very radical notion of equality. You want to see that secularism must be understood without any confusion that it endorses a principle of equality.
That's true.
That is to say, without this equality principle being asserted in a very affirmative manner, secularism seems to be losing out or thinning out as far as its meaning is concerned. So this approach to equality would also be a new approach to democracy, because for a very long time people have been concerned about freedom, liberty. These were issues. A recent book which has come up, Michael Ignatieff's biography of Isaac Berlin, in which there is something very important that he discusses about Berlin, that Berlin made a very profound or sort of popular argument that liberty is liberty and there is no substitute for liberty. Equality is not liberty, justice is not liberty, and all that. Are you introducing or endorsing the notion of equality in this very profound primordial sense?
Unless you anchor democracy in some kind of a value, it becomes free-floating. But when we look into the principle of freedom, it seems to me that the principle of freedom, the philosophical argument for freedom, presupposes agential capacity, that if individuals have to be given agency, then they need freedom. But more importantly, everybody should have that agential capacity. That means people should be free, but everybody should be free. Now, if that is so, then the precondition for freedom becomes equalities. And as I said, I'm reluctant to push the point too far, but it seemed to me that it would be more profitable to approach the concept of democracy from that of equality, given that democracy at its most elementary sense involves the principle of one person, one vote, and build in a definition of freedom within equality. I mean, these two, equality and freedom, need not be in tension, but they often have been in tension. And if there is a contradiction between the two, I would rather prefer equality, because freedom, as you would know more than me, easily translates into freedom for some and the unfreedom of others, whereas equality would prohibit such an appropriation.
It's much more binding, isn't it?
It is much more binding.
It makes
yes.
secularism much more effective, that is to say.
Yes,
in terms of minority rights.
Yes, yes, because then if you go into the whole idea of equality, we find that equality is also an extremely complex principle. And the way it presents itself to us initially as everybody should be treated equally is completely kind of subverted, if not subverted, at least altered, if we look at the fact that the constituency which we are dealing with is profoundly unequal. Now, if you're going to treat unequal people equally, we'll end up reproducing inequality. Therefore, radical democrats and egalitarians have for a long time, ever since the days of Marxism, told us that equality cannot be taken only as formal equality, but as substantive equality, which tells you that if certain of the groups that we are dealing with are unequal in their social and political conditions, then they must be treated differently. In fact, they must be given access to supportive social and political environments. And if that can be applied to, for example, social and economic inequality, in this book I've tried to apply it in the case of religious minorities.
Yeah. This is exactly the problem, isn't it? That the majoritarian principles or majoritarian consciousness has not been able to accept this kind of differential treatment.
Yes.
They think that it's pampering the minorities. And in fact, one of the main arguments of Hindu fundamentalism, if I can call it, has been this grievance, isn't it? I mean, what is the confusion? Why are they confused about this differential treatment? Why can't they grasp the equality principle, which actually allows this differential principle to be legitimate?
Because I think many people are treating secularism as sarvam dharam sambhav, therefore formal equality. Whereas any informed political theorist would know the difference between equalitarianism and egalitarianism. And if you carry the equality principle to its radical fulfillment, it would be the principle of differential treatment. Inform our understanding or our discussion of equality if we are going to look at how our deeply hierarchical and unequal society can be made a little more equal than it is at the present moment.
This is very interesting because, it troubled me while I was reading a book. Some of the principles, some of the very important questions of democracy, say of equality and all that, you consider to be universally self-evident.
Yes.
And you presume it, and on the basis of which you construct this very beautiful theory of secularism as equality and minority rights being guaranteed through this renewed notion of equality as secularism. I mean, our society is very unequal.
Yes.
How can we take this kind of self-evidence of equality and democracy? I mean, the 50, 60 years of experience of democracy in this country is already in trouble. A lot of confusion around. People just simply do not grasp how the concepts have been introduced, how they've been brought into our consciousness, how this polity has become a possibility for us. In this kind of situation, how can we, I'm afraid that theoretical relevance of your position just simply might be missed by a lot of people. Because they practice inequality as if it is a very self-evident experience of normal human life. They practice inequality against women, children, lower caste. I mean, this society is so unequal, it's unbelievable.
Yes. You see, you look at somebody like John Rawls, when he, speaking as a Western liberal thinker, when he is talking about the priority principle of liberty, he doesn't need to make out a philosophical justification for liberty, because liberty is already a part of their tradition. It has been a part of their tradition since the days of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes had to make a philosophical argument for liberty, as did John Locke 300 years ago. So after 300 years, you can take it as a given, whether it is liberty or whether it is equality. But in India, you have a problem. If you say, all right, you can't take anything for given, because we are living in a very deeply inegalitarian and a very deeply hierarchical society. So it seems to make sense to me, I may be wrong, that if we start off with certain basic presuppositions, A, that equality is a self-evidently moral supposition, and if anybody believes in inequality, let them do the proof. We don't have
I like
to prove.
that. I mean, it's very smart, all right, to put the burden of proving or disproving something.
Yeah, I mean, let them prove why inequality is a better way of being than equality. And I think equality is not so new for Indians, because it has been, after all, instituted and legitimized by the freedom movement and by a series of egalitarian movements after independence. And the Dalit movement is a very important example, as is the women's movement. The second aspect, however, I could not leave it like that, because it struck me precisely for the reasons that you have mentioned. So I've allied it to a companion concept, and that is the moral worth of human beings. And I don't think the two can be separated. When you subscribe to equality, you subscribe to the moral worth of human beings, and vice versa.
Probably that will be more difficult for who would be your possible critics, maybe, to deny that one, the second one,
because
second argument.
Yeah, we must not underestimate the power of the democratic imagination, the power that it has exerted over the collective psyche. I think people have got used to democracy.
Yeah, people have got used to democracy, and they have begun, perhaps not so clearly, but value human dignity, isn't it? After all, if it was not valued, there won't be so many movements.
Yes, of course, you have struggles, and that's partly the reason why, I mean, after all, ideals are always instituted as a part of the collective consciousness through struggles. We can only write books, but ultimately it has to be a political movement that grounds them so firmly in the collective consciousness that if anybody believes inequality is better, let them do the argument,
because they'll be trapped
philosophical
then,
defense, right?
That is a trap that you've laid for them. The other argument, which I found very interesting, and I think most people living in such societies as of India, where inequality is practiced without any remorse, it's practiced as a part of their cosmological understanding and all that. It seems that inequality is self-explained, all right? Casteism, caste system is self-explained because it conforms to a certain kind of divine order and moral order and all that. The other interesting thing that comes into this book is that people who are living in these kinds of societies would like to improve themselves, would like to change themselves. This is also great hope, isn't it?
Yes.
And so there is a great enthusiasm with which you discuss questions of rights, individualism, and communitarianism. As if there is a possibility for people who are living with a very communitarian conceptions, that is to say, constitutive conceptions of themselves as part of society and as not to begin with as individuals. For them, there is a hope that they could, along with living a communitarian identification or identity, they could live also an individualist life. That is to say, they could also share the modern world without any problem, isn't it? You make as if the paradox does not exist, that there is a way out, that individuals are social. They are part of the society, still they are individuals. This is a very great argument. Can you just say a little more?
Well, I thought the contemporary argument was going round in circles. I mean, either you're an individualist or you're a communitarian. Whereas you can be both. I mean, sometimes you can be in community and be individualistic, and as an individual, you feel desperately the need for community. I think communitarianism has expanded our concept of what it means to be human, but it has also taken away a lot that liberal individualism values, such as autonomy or reflective capacity or the ability to criticize. I hope one can find a third way between liberalism and communitarianism, and I've called it individual in community, not individual and or community.
Yeah.
Except that you have to realize that, you know, you start off with certain given tradition. We're all placed in a certain tradition. That does not preclude the fact that we are also gifted with certain reflective capacity to rework that tradition, and we see it most obviously in the areas of our most sacred beliefs, such as religion. You look at the convulsions that Hinduism has undergone in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the kind of questions that have been asked, the kind of criticism that has been voiced. So I think people rework a tradition, and that reworking of a tradition is what gives to the individual his or her specificity.
Your critics might point out that by inventing this new space, and I think your favorite is Bill Kimlicka here, who has given you some ideas to how multicultural societies have to be visualized, in which both cultural rights and individual rights could be protected with the same argument, isn't it? Your critics just might simply point out that by doing this, by making individual part of the community, and by taking individuals out of community, putting the individual somewhere in the middle, you have thinned out both conceptions. How will you answer that?
Well, I find it difficult to subscribe to a thick notion of community, given the current globalization. I mean, how can we imagine that the self-understanding of a community remains as it was, historically valid for all times? After all, we do have a process of translation going on, a process of mediation, modification, the meeting of 2, 3, 4, 5 cultures, and maybe the creation of an additional culture. So a thick notion of the community is what I would find it difficult to accept. I also would be reluctant to accept it, because in India that would mean accepting a great deal of social evil, such as caste panchayats, and we all know what caste panchayats are capable of. Secondly, I also do not think you can subscribe to a notion of the individual. We have been doing it for a long time, much to our constraint, much to our concern. Suddenly we find that individuals are very much a part of the community, whether it was the events of 1990, and that is Mandal, or 1992, that was masjids. And suddenly you find people defining themselves either in caste terms or in religious terms. Suddenly you realize that individuals think of themselves as belonging to a community, which enters their consciousness, maybe in subtle ways, maybe in overt ways, but it seems to me that at moments of crisis, you find your community. You find your community to give you answers to certain very perplexing problems.
Perhaps the most important argument of the book, in my view still, which we have not discussed as yet, is that you employ this third way of arguing or participating in this debate of communitarianism and individualism, which is also sort of termed as a debate between rights and goods and all that, that you make an argument in favor of minority rights. You employ this argument to re-argue or to argue afresh that with this kind of position, we find a better chance for minorities to live a dignified life in societies such as India, or societies or countries where people from different other societies or cultures have moved in. Because it is a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
Identity is a problem, and we've got to somehow tie it up or explain it in terms of rights. I think that argument for the validation of right to culture, discussed in terms of individual rights, is something very innovative and very important. I mean, there could not be any other argument, I think,
Yes.
for the minorities, because majoritarianism, for some reason, has got a lease of life, at least in India. And this argument seems to be making a sense. But just for the sake of critics, let me say, if your critics point out that by giving a right to culture to, say, religious communities, you have allowed them a breather, perhaps, but by not allowing them to be communitarian in a very thicker sense, by making a space within the community for individual rights, you take away lots from them.
Yes, true. Partly because one does tend to fall within this dualism of individual and community, or community. Is anybody familiar with the literature? Ultimately our stands on these questions have to be both moral and political. They have to be validated. Now, by subscribing to a thick conception of community and by not giving the individual a chance to escape the stranglehold of the community, you open the ways for infinite perpetuation of gender injustice. And that was something I find it difficult to reconcile. The problem, Savita, is between the Western communitarians and the Indian communitarian, there's a vast gap.
I'm glad you're pointing it out, because these are the issues which, because in political theory, these are the little differences which make a whole lot of difference in arguments. And I'm glad that you're making it at the moment.
Because the Western communitarians are, after all, speaking of things like neighborhood communities, or I don't exactly know, they don't define community, if you notice.
Christopher Lasch.
Right. Now, when we speak of community, we're speaking of religion, and religion can be enormously oppressive for the dissenting individual or the individual who wants to exit. So whereas I feel that an individual will not be complete unless you grant him or her the right to exist within community or as a part of a community, and therefore they must be given the right to community. You also cannot subordinate the individual to the community, because you pave open the way for far too many evils which we have been fighting against for at least 150 years.
Don't you think it will be too presumptuous, but it seems that there are two arguments as far as treating the minorities are concerned. One would be, say, Partha Chatterjee way. You allow the minorities to deal with themselves completely. You do not even make a suggestion that they should respect individual rights. Let them be influenced by whatever the dominant values are, and self-realize that individual rights are extremely important. It will make a whole lot of difference in their lives. It will provide new kind of dignity which their religion could not provide them with, and so on and so forth. The other one is that boldly you make a suggestion that, look, the price for this kind of security that you're receiving in terms of right to culture, which is a communitarian right, you've got to also accept a right that individuals receive.
Yeah, by virtue of the same argument by which the minority groups are given rights.
Yeah. So I think the argument that you are making, if it is taken well by the people who are intelligent and all that, and who are thinking, I mean, even self-thinking in terms of their cultural right, opening up the community in their own way, even though they get some time and all that, would it not be a very appropriate way to deal with majoritarianism in their own terms? Because if you leave them, I mean, I don't want to sound presumptuous again, but if you leave them to self-reflect and, pressures of economy, pressures of globalization, pressures of various other kinds of other religions, majority religion, is just so much that
communities are turning inwards.
Of course.
Communities are turning inwards, right. I'm afraid the more there is majoritarian and a backlash, the more communities will tend to become more tyrannical, because they start looking backwards, they start looking inwards.
We've had examples of this sort already.
Yes.
Rajiv Gandhi's time, Shah Banu case and all that.
Shah Banu case, and subsequently also. And you know, this is grist to the mill as far as the majoritarians are concerned, because in the same way, look at the communities, whereas enough work has been done to show how the so-called majority community also oppresses its own vulnerable sections, whether it is the women or the so-called lower castes. My feeling is that, you see, there are two levels. One is we have to understand that individuals are not mere individuals. They are located in a tradition, and if you want to respect the individual, you have to respect the tradition. Secondly, what is the point in giving rights to individuals to life, liberty, property when they are liable to be deprived of these rights because they happen to be members of a community which is targeted through the politics of hate, through the politics of ill will? And the third argument is, as you've pointed out, that of equality, that you know, if we are committed to equality, and if this has been put in the preamble of the Constitution, then let us think out what equality means. But this is not by any means, I hope, a carte blanche to the patriarchal sections of the minority communities to start constructing their identity on the dead bodies of their own vulnerable sections, women or the oppressed sections. We have just seen what had happened to Asghar Ali Engineer in the Bohra community. He was beaten up by the leader of the followers of the spiritual leader. So this kind of appropriation of community by patriarchal leaderships is something that I personally would resist, and every right-thinking Democrat would resist it. At the same time, you have to say, look, they have a right to their culture. So I do think all of us who are dealing with this subject are in a bit of a bind. And we are all trying desperately to look for some kind of a compromise between the rights to community, the rights of community, and the rights of the individual. How you do it, I don't think, incidentally, Wilkimlicka has resolved the problem.
In your book,
yeah,
I do see, if we just simply drop that self-evident moral position, that seems to be a bit reading too much in what is self-evident to us. What is self-evident to us is very, very problematic. I can feel it very much while doing a political theory of this sort. But what has happened, and what I'm extremely glad, is that a lot of people who were democratic, who were liberal, they have come to understand that individualism of an atomist kind had its blindness, and that we have to move away from there to make a meaningful political theory possible. That is to say, we have to renegotiate a relationship between rights and goods. That is to say, political theory is not about predicting a good society or directing a society towards some sort of free life, but caring for a good society.
True.
And a good society is one where everybody has equality, women, children, oppressed, minorities, and all that. And Professor Neera Chandhok has just made that attempt in this book. I'm so happy that we have a book. I recommend it very much personally. It's a fine work of political theory, and I congratulate her for writing this book. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.